Good afternoon. I am Dr. Mascaram Glegzaber, Assistant Clinical Professor and the Director of Inclusion and Community Engagement at the School of Human Evolution and Social Change here at Arizona State University. I feel incredibly privileged to be able to provide timely and important programming such as today's lecture, and want to thank all of you for joining us today. Welcome to the third lecture of our new colloquium series this fall, Toward a Liberatory Theory and Praxis. This monthly series aims to highlight the work of contemporary scholars belonging to identities and traditions marginalized within mainstream Western academia, who through their work confront neocolonial power structures and challenge longstanding norms of knowledge production. Was born out of a demand from our graduate students for exposure to more critical scholarship and that is relevant to their lived experiences and the times in which we are living today. Specifically, again, I want to thank Nalubega Ross, Anais Roque, Tisa Lowen, and Aaliyah Hoff, some of our graduate students who worked with me to conceptualize this series and establish its parameters. I also want to acknowledge SHESC leadership for supporting and sponsoring this series, specifically our director, Dr. Chris Stojanowski. Today's talk will be the final lecture of the series for this fall, but we will be back in January hosting 4 more speakers in the spring. So please be on the lookout for more information on those talks as they become available in the coming weeks and months. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker today, I want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. Please note that this presentation will be recorded, but the Q&A session to follow will not. You, the audience, will not be visible in the recording and all of the mics will be turned off. As I mentioned, we will be leaving time for questions at the end, and we're asking that you write any questions or comments that you might have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will be helping our guest speaker keep track of the questions and select which ones she will answer. If you would like to ask the question yourself rather than have me read it out, please put in parentheses, ask live after you post the question in the comments. That way we can unmute you and allow you to verbalize it yourself. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michelle Téllez. Dr. Téllez is an assistant professor in the Department of Mexican American Studies at the University of Arizona and writes about transnational community formations, Chicana feminism, and gendered migration. A founding member of the Chicana Motherwork Collective, the Arizona San Jarocho Collective, and the Binational Arts Residency Project, Dr. Téllez has a long history in grassroots organizing projects and community-based arts and performance. She co-edited the Chicana Motherwork anthology, Porque Si No Hay Revolución, published in March of 2019, and her forthcoming book, Autonomy in the Spaces of Neoliberal Neglect, Las Mujeres de Moclavio Rojas, will be out fall of 2021. Her lecture today is titled Beyond the Wall, Fronteriza Imaginaries. So everyone, please help me in welcoming Dr. Michelle Téllez.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's such an honor to be with you all virtually. I'm here on Tohono O'odham land, also known as Tucson, Tucson, Shuxon, Arizona. I want to thank the School of Human Evolution and Social Change and Dr. Glegzaber for inviting me here today to be in conversation with you all through this really important colloquia series. Thank you for organizing it and making it possible. My appreciation also extends to all the people and programs, named and unnamed, who made this event possible. So thank you. Thank you so much. So I grew up in the border city of San Diego, adjacent to Tijuana, Mexico. The experiences of racialized and cultural exclusions sharply defined who I became as a scholar, writer, teacher, activist, community member, and mother. Therefore, home for me is the borderlands, and my persona has been deeply shaped by a transfronteriza, trans-border experience, which in turn has determined the kind of work that I do, that I offer, that I'm compelled to collaborate around, ultimately because I find value in public pedagogy, in embedded praxis, in cultural arts production, and in producing knowledge with and about communities who are embodying creation resistance. So I'm a Chicana transfronteriza. My mother was from a small town in the state of Jalisco, Tomatlan, and my father was born and raised in Chicago, but his family also came from the same state in Mexico. My transborder experience shapes my work as an interdisciplinary scholar of Chicanx studies. I use the concept of transfronteriza or transborderness in my work in 3 ways. First, I use it to illustrate my personal history as a border dweller negotiating the US-Mexico border and the tensions created from belonging neither here nor there. Not only did I grow up crossing and recrossing the gendered, class, and racialized borders that were placed on me, but I also navigated the international demarcation between San Diego and Tijuana regularly. I often joke with my students that I grew up on going to Tijuana to Comercial Mexicana to buy groceries because before NAFTA, it was cheaper to do so in the 80s. And so I grew up eating like Fruity Loopies instead of Fruit Loops, right? So as opposed to choosing lados or sides, I eventually came to understand that my life and experiences could only be aptly understood from this transborder perspective, one that disrupts the border as a line of separation. I also use transfronteriza to describe my role as a researcher who examines the effects of transnational policies and companies on US-Mexico border communities. Third, I use the concept of transfronteriza as a generative one that will help us better understand the ways in which women border dwellers are responding to transnational processes and the effects of neoliberal policies. I argue that the actual US-Mexico border should not just be seen as a site of passage, but also as a site for gender transformation where a politicized transfronteriza identity can emerge and as a place where we can understand what Rebecca Citrin calls the everyday revolution in social relationships. So my talk, Beyond the Wall, Fronteriza Imaginaries, is an invitation to disrupt normative discourses about the border, to think beyond the geopolitical demarcation, to ask how we can imagine the borderlands as a site and a space of resistance, conviviality, agency, and creative community building, one that differs from the rhetoric of invasion, crime, insecurity, violence, and illegality that is popularized in the media. The research and stories that I'll share today are rooted in experiential knowledge and many years of community-rooted research in this region. So I want to begin with a mapping of the border. Here's an image, of course, of that 2,000-mile-long stretch. And the border that I grew up in, right, is all the way to the west, right? And that like coincides with the Pacific Ocean, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But I want to map this border as a way to provide some context to my talk. So the border as we know it today was formed only 170 years ago with the signing of the Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase. Now I say only because when I think of my students in my classes here in Tucson, many of them have been in the region for up to 8 generations, which means that these families have been here since before the establishment of the border. However, the divide became associated with a set of practices of inclusion and exclusion affecting communities on both sides of the boundary, and as an apparatus of genocidal warfare that might be most apparent on the Tohono O'odham Nation, located in what is now known as the states of Arizona and Sonora. You can skip this slide. Thank you. The US-Mexico border traces a violent line across the O'odham land, destroying an ancestral crossing point that involves not only families, but also the natural environment, animals, water, and tradition. US-Mexico border communities have been experiencing what sociologist Timothy Dunn has described as low-intensity conflict since the 1970s. The people who live, work, go to school, and build families and community along the different cities and towns at this 2,000-mile-long stretch have witnessed the growing technologies, weaponry, border agents, and increasing militarization of the last 30 years, realities that impact border residents' mobility and livelihood. So for example, in 2010, border agents at the San Isidro port of entry beat and discharged a taser multiple times on Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, a longtime San Diego resident, which ultimately led to his untimely death. In June later that year, Sergio Adrián Hernández Huereca, a 15-year-old resident of Mexico, was shot in the head by a Border Patrol agent, even though Sergio was on the Mexican side of the border in Ciudad Juárez, and the agent was on the US side in El Paso. Again, closer to home where we are currently, in 2012, a border agent standing behind the border fence in Nogales, Arizona, shot and killed Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, who was walking along a sidewalk in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. The agent claims he acted in self-defense against rock throwers on the other side. And this is an image that I took in Nogales, Arizona, looking at the border towards Mexico. So again, the agent claimed he acted in self-defense. And more recently, and the list can go on, but more recently, in 3 weeks ago in San Diego, in October, there was another man, David Angel Villalobos, who was killed by Border Patrol in San Isidro, which is the border city of San Diego County, and where they argued that he was attempting to make an unauthorized crossing into the United States. These tragic events do not dissuade anti-immigrant rhetoric that also fuels support for the enhanced border wall, which, from a human rights perspective, violates several international norms, including the rights of indigenous peoples, the right to private property, and the right to non-discrimination. Moreover, the wall has serious long-term environmental effects. Of course, none of this is new. In 2008, 36 federal laws were waived thanks to the Real ID Act of 2005, which granted the Secretary of Homeland Security the authority to waive any law as is necessary to ensure expeditious construction of border barriers and related infrastructure. Currently, the Department of Homeland Security has waived 72 laws to build proposed sections of the border wall in Arizona and California near national parklands. In 2011, the Surf Fence project was funded along the San Diego-Tijuana border that cost $4.3 million to further solidify a border barrier that extends 300 feet into the Pacific Ocean. So I pause here because the engineers believe that a steel fence can and will separate the ocean. I want you to sit with that. Last year, they started ripping out the grandfather saguaro plants near Lukeville, Arizona, in the Oregon Cactus National Monument Park for the construction of the border wall. These saguaros can only be found here in the Sonoran Desert. They grow about an inch every 10 years, and their lifespan is between 150 to 200 years. This devastation is palpable. O'odham land defenders have been arrested as they try and protect these sacred sites. Yet the public does not hear about this in the national or international mainstream media, nor does it recognize the wall itself as illegal due to these violations. Furthermore, in what may be the biggest contradiction of the global market, just as capital and goods were able to freely cross North American national borders with the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994, migrant bodies became increasingly policed under the Clinton administration's Operation Gatekeeper, which was in San Diego, Tijuana, Operation Hold the Line, which was in El Paso, Texas. The unintended consequences of border militarization along these previously heavily trafficked areas in Southern California and Texas funneled migrants into the deadly Sonoran Desert. This has led to an increase in deaths, with statistics showing that migrant deaths have doubled in the last 20 years. Since 1998, more than 7,216 men, women, and children have lost their lives while crossing the US-Mexico border. In Arizona alone, at least 2,202 people died between the years of 2001 and 2013. So given these conditions, how is it that I am proposing an alternative mapping of the border? I'm not arguing that we should ignore these realities. In fact, it is imperative that we do not look away, that we have an acute analysis of these continued colonial legacies affecting the border region. However, I am asking us to reimagine our framing. In other words, the border is seen as a static place defined only by the political boundary. What is often ignored are the experiences of border dwellers who, while marked by the political and economic policies decided by distant power holders, make life happen in meaningful ways every day. So I set forward these questions. How do these everyday practices differ from the information we are pummeled with in the media? News bites that render migrants as criminal and border residents as non-existent, a language that is directly tied to a culture that supports increased border enforcement at any cost and with any consequence, including the kidnapping of children and the separation of families. How do we recognize the capacity and will of the human spirit to be defiant in the face of imposing boundaries and to show how intersecting culturas, geographies, and histories of the borderlands produce realities and experiences that must be named, understood, and recognized? The borderlands do not only bear an open wound, borrowing from La Maestra, Gloria, and Saldua, but conscious community for the 82 million people who call it their home. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is introduce you to the work happening across 2 locations that I've been living and working in for the last 20 plus years, namely the San Diego-Tijuana border community and the Sonoran corridor, which includes Nogales, Mexico, Nogales, Arizona, Tucson, and Phoenix. So speaking from these places and centering the experiences of mujeres fronterizas or border women, I want to tell you about the creative strategies of resistance that have emerged in the borderlands, including the practice of autonomy, cross-border labor organizing, and the practice of transnational solidarity, and border disruptions through socially engaged art, also known as artivism. So the first, autonomy. So my study of autonomy on the border began in Tijuana when I met Teresa Fernandez, a community leader and one of several women who have been fighting for the welfare and prosperity of their community called Maquiladoras. Mi único delito es trabajar por la gente, she said to me one day. My only crime is to work for the people. We were meeting at the patio of an unfamiliar home located in a new development in Tijuana, Mexico. This was one of many of our clandestine meetings during her 6-year exile from the community that she helped to create and lead since she was 20 years old. In December of 2002, Maquiladoras was raided by local police who were responding to allegations of theft and water leveled by the local Department of Water and Power. Due to her role as a leader and organizer of the community, Hortensia's home was targeted and surrounded by the heavily armed police, although she managed to evade arrest by fleeing and was forced into hiding. 3 outstanding warrants for her arrest were issued at the time of the police raid. She says her house was surrounded by the police as if she were the worst or best drug trafficker. So for me, this makes me reflect on who is criminalized and what activities are deemed criminal in the borderlands. Over the last 50 years, the United States-Mexico border region has experienced profound social, economic, and political shifts due to policies enacted by local and national governments, the implementation of international trade agreements, and shifts in population. Migrants are forced north out of the interior of Mexico, and sometimes, instead of making the treacherous journey across the desert, end up in these border cities such as Tijuana. Despite poor labor conditions, most of these migrant workers have little option but to seek employment in the maquiladoras run by transnational companies. Yet Mexican border cities lack the necessary infrastructure to meet housing, healthcare, and educational needs of these growing population of workers. So in this image, you see a mural of a man, and that is actually the man, Maquiladoras, who was a Mixteco Oaxacan migrant who had come to the Baja California, San Quintin area to work as a farm worker for the community of growers growing tomatoes. And he became organized with other workers and was trying to fight against the unjust conditions in which they found themselves living and working. And in 1987 was actually killed by one of the local growers for his organizing efforts. So in his honor, the families that first settled on these vacant lands on this land between Tecate and Tijuana, which is, the community itself is only 5 miles from the US-Mexico border, but if you're coming from the city of Tijuana, it's about 10 miles. And on the other side is Tecate to the east. So these families came together in 1988. There was about 25 families, and they took over this land and squatted on this national lands in hopes of establishing what was called an ejido, or a communal land base. But of course, there is a complicated history of agrarian reform that I want to clarify. So after the Mexican Revolution, there was a constitution that created the Agrarian Reform Law of 1917, which basically gave campesinos, or farm workers, idle national land to live and farm on in the form of ejidos. However, if you fast forward, as a precursor to NAFTA, which, remember, it was implemented in 1994, in 1993, just a year before, the president at the time, Salinas de Gortari, removed Article 27 from the Mexican Constitution, and the obligation to distribute land to qualified petitioner was immediately ended. So communal land would now be available for sale or rent to either Mexican or foreign companies. So of course, Maclovio Rojas is kind of at the crux of this. 1988, they should have been granted their lands, but they were denied this communal land grant. And since then, we're talking now a 30-year history, the community and the state have been in a prolonged battle for this prized land. This has meant battling repressive strategies imposed by the state government, land invasions, living in a life where there are no public services, schools, electricity, running water, especially in those early years. And then despite the legal wrangling involved, the community has continued to grow. When the leadership of Maclovio Rojas declared their settlement and autonomous in the early 90s, they did so as a response to the denial of basic human services, both by the federal and by the state governments. In other words, and what I call in my forthcoming book, they did this in the space of neoliberal neglect, right? Organizing for basic services, education for their children, and healthcare was driven by necessity rather than an ideological or explicitly political conviction. Hortensia told me, necessity has made the community autonomous because although we have the same rights as all Mexicans because we pay taxes, we are denied everything. If the government doesn't give us what we need, then they obligate us to organize ourselves. So we built our schools, we created a sports field, and we did it all working together. This is why we are autonomous. We haven't been given absolutely anything but problems. So I wanted to share some photos that have materialized their experience of autonomy. The first one is that's the entrance. So that's an MR. And that's the entrance to the community. I mean, I won't talk a whole lot about it here, but there was a lot of transnational solidarity efforts in the community of Maclovio Rojas from US-based arts organizations, namely BAUTAF, which is the Border Arts Workshop, or Taller de Arte Fronterizo, and so they were able to support in the building of a lot of the infrastructure of the community. So this is just one sign that was created in order to mark where the entrance to the community was. And you can show me the next one. This is the Aguascalientes. So as a response to the Zapatista movement, which emerges the same year and the same date that NAFTA was going to be implemented, or was implemented in 1994, the Zapatista uprising emerges in the south of Mexico and the state of Chiapas, calling an end to indigenous exclusion and to recognizing their rights to their traditions, to their rights to autonomy, and to self-determine their lives. And they received a lot of international support. And they used to send these really interesting communiques. I mean, I think that if you think about it, like the Zapatistas were one of the first to really use these like massive networking opportunities to talk about their struggle and to get information across internationally through these emails before, social media. And then they would do these declarations. And in the sixth declaration, they basically said, in a call to civil society, they basically said, thank you for your support of our movement, but we are calling on all civil society to create in their own communities, these spaces where you can gather as cultural and political actors, and to make change in the neighborhoods and the communities in which you come from. So they're basically saying, thank you for your support, but you need to do the work you need to do at home. And so in response to that, Maclovio Rojas created their own, what's called an Aguascalientes. And so what the Zapatistas did is they called these community centers Aguascalientes in honor of the Mexican Revolution, where in the city where much of the defense between the revolutionaries and the state was happening, right? And so This Aguas Calientes was created in Maquiladoras, and this space basically became the center of the community where they had meetings, festivals, had organized workshops. And of course, you can see some of those murals, which I'll talk about in a second. Up the upstairs was a place for residencies to come in. You can show me the next slide. And this is actually a really interesting picture that was captured by a student that I took to the community many years ago. And it shows how residents had to connect to power, because initially the government would not, the city wouldn't provide power to the community. Instead, they had to then tap into the generators that brought power to the surrounding maquiladoras, right? And so this is another reason why the community land was very important to the state, was because it had been vacant, and with the shifting land tenure requirements, we saw an increase of border factories, right? I mean, and these have been in effect since the border industrial program in the 1960s. However, there was a shift with the implementation of NAFTA. So what the residents did, I think, really interestingly, right, was to then tap into those generators that were given to the maquiladoras, or the border factories. However, of course, this created situations that could have been very dangerous, especially in the rain, for young people. And you can go to the next slide. Oh, and this is just an image of how one of the schools. So this is the second school that they built in the community. And then in the next image, you'll see the residents basically coming together with supplies that they would receive from the US. And a lot of the homes are actually built with garage doors that were discarded from the United States. And so you'll see that even in some of the initial construction of the schools, they were built from these same garage doors. And sometimes some of the materials were donated from the US as well. And so this is the residents coming together to create a place for the kids to be educated. The next one. And they've also built, in honoring, the need to create a space for women of the community, they created a Casa de la Mujer, or a women's center, which also hosted like a daycare center for many of the kids who were working, whose parents were working in the maquiladoras, right? And so really they paid, I think it was like $10 a month or maybe a week to, to have their children fed and be taken care of. And this was really a symbolic fee, because they wanted to demonstrate the support of the women who, had to leave their homes in order to work. The next one. Okay, and then this is just one of those murals that I mentioned earlier. And what it says is in Spanish, but it says, "At night, rattlesnakes sleep with women, and from the heat of their dreams, women are awakened and are surprised to see them sleeping with them." And so this is basically a mural, an oral, honoring those oral histories of those early women squatters who, when they first arrived, didn't have techos, didn't have roofs, right? And so, and the land, they were barely trying to, to create a space for them and settle on it. And so they talk about waking up with, with rattlesnakes next to them. And then the next one is also another mural that says, "Their well for water came from the moon. When lightning struck, the women used a canvas for a cup and drank from it." And so basically this is talking about how they would use tarps for cover. And because they didn't have access to water, they would wait for the rains to come, and then they would capture the water in the tarp as a way to hold on to to hold on to water for them, for washing. So I can go on and on about Maquiladoras, but I just wanted to sort of provide a snapshot of their experience, of their community, and really explain how the residents demonstrate a shared commitment to collective action through the establishment and defense of their autonomous community, and where they imagine the world that they seek to create now, right? And then I'm gonna move on to another project where I examined how grassroots organizations are collaborating both binationally and locally in the San Diego-Tijuana border region, where they created for many years, it was a really strong movement, worker-centered spaces for change. Now, the rapidly changing global economy causes constant shift in production, and this is still true. Stability, worker conditions, this maquiladora industry has drawn migrant workers consistently for over 40 years. And really this is sort of an effect of the Bracero program ending here in the United States. And so in collusion, in some ways with the US, the Mexican nation created this border industrial program in order to provide jobs for those returning workers. And so while the border economy depends on the maquiladora industry, the lives of the workers are deemed disposable. And so I want to talk about 3 organizations that were active between the late 90s all the way through 2015. And they're called the Colectiva Feminista Binacional, which is a feminist collective, the Feminist Border Collective, or Binational Border Collective, CITAC, which is a worker rights center, a support center for workers, and the San Diego Maquiladora Worker Solidarity Network. And so these 3 grassroots organizations really focus on worker-centered spaces that challenge the disposability and emerged really as advocates for many workers seeking resolution to their unjust working conditions. Through the creation of these autonomous infrastructures, these groups offer legal support, worker rights workshops, and the opportunity for cross-border actions to pressure the transnational companies for whom they work. Now I'm going to tell you a story of somebody that I was able to work with and interview and talk with. Her name is Vicky, and she was a worker in a factory there in Tijuana that would assemble cardboard boxes. And she worked for this company for many months and had worked as like a general assistant, right? And so when one day when her production line slowed down, she was asked to organize boxes on a high shelf, right? And so she climbed this 48-step ladder and proceeded to do as asked. The next thing she remembers, as she told me, was waking up with a nurse by her side in the company infirmary. She had fallen from the top of the ladder and had been unconscious for 20 minutes. When asked to sit up, she felt a sharp pain in her back and was unable to feel her legs. As a result of this accident, Vicky became paralyzed from the waist down and suffers from dementia. She was 34 at the time when I did the interview. The company she worked for claimed no responsibility for her fall, did not cover medical costs, and did not provide her and her family with severance pay for loss of work hours. So after a desperate year of closed doors, trying to figure out what to do within the company, the family turned to these organizations, especially CITAC, for assistance. And it was there where she had her injuries recognized for the first time, and people were willing to advocate on her behalf. Now, this is an image of, they used to do this thing called El Boletín Maquilero, which was kind of like a news bulletin, a flyer. There's this place in Tijuana called the 5 y 10, which is where all the buses sort of come together, and you will find a lot of maquiladora workers there because they're taking their buses to their respective jobs. And with this news bulletin, they use it as an organizing tool, really to let workers know that they existed. This is how Vicky found out about it. And they would pass out these boletines, right, to basically teach workers about their rights, and to recognize that they had a place to go. And they also would make these little small, sort of like a first aid kit, so that the employers wouldn't see what they were receiving, right? And so it said, it said like first aid on it, basically in Spanish, but it was all about worker rights. Anyways, and so this comes from the Boletín Maquilero, and it's basically a comparison. It's a poem by one of the workers who talks about how it's comparing the experiences between being imprisoned and working in a maquila, right? And saying that in some ways that a maquiladora worker has less rights than somebody who has been imprisoned. And so they're really trying to call attention to the ways in which these workers are treated as disposable, right? And these multinational companies that own these maquiladoras, they thrive and maximize profits through the recruitment of cheap labor, the implementation of strict labor conduct rules, non-compliance with safety, environmental, and labor standards. These business practices, of course, create catastrophic environmental, health, and social problems that affect workers' labor experience. And of course, these consequences are exacerbated for border women and workers, right? The conditions of structural violence weigh more heavily as they bear the greatest responsibility for alleviating the effects in terms of the social reproduction that they do in their homes and in their communities. And while there have been some recent shifts, historically women have comprised a larger part of the maquiladora workforce through strategic recruitment efforts due to a presumed level of dexterity and naivete, right? They didn't think that women would organize. So currently in the city of Tijuana, there are 47 industrial parks with which each employ 200,000 workers who in 2 12-hour shifts continue production 24 hours a day. The minimum wage is 54 pesos, which is about $4, not an hour, but per day, right? And a gallon of milk costs approximately 45 pesos. So most maquiladora workers do not make more than $50 a week. The impact of the dangerously low salaries on families is exacerbated by the humiliation they face at the factories. Workers are often required to agree to a set of rules related to dress code, bathroom use, breaks, and water consumption. I've actually been able to see one of the workers one time was able to sneak one of these agreements out to show me what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do while working. Women's rights are frequently violated through the use of random pregnancy tests, which can include the revealing of one's underwear to prove that they are having a menstruation cycle. And of course, there's sexual harassment by power holders, such as their supervisors. Now, CITAC, this is an entrance to what was the Worker Center in Tijuana for many years. And what they did was they organized a plan of action that draws on Mexican federal labor law that was also rooted in the Mexican Constitution that I mentioned earlier. And they've been using this, they've sort of been flipping their strategies to use the federal labor laws against these transnational giants, right? And these are some of the action plans or some of the things that they wanted, right? So this legal code actually provides appropriate parameters for workers that include 8-hour workdays, vacation time, health and safety regulations. But federal law lacks a clause that addresses sexual harassment and gender discrimination. What's interesting is that they use the law to fight for the rights of their members in these city labor courts. So in so doing, a lot of these organizers become de facto lawyers themselves, right? And they become really familiar with the text, with legal code. And so while CITAC really has been the one to address the needs of all workers, and in fact, it was the first to combat and win in the early 1990s a sexual harassment case, the Colectiva Feminista Binacional, or the Feminist Collective, really was an organization that was created to focus on the issue of women's rights. So this group was formed in 2004, and it existed over 10 years. And many of the members define themselves as activists, feminists, maquiladora workers, zapatistas, environmentalists, students, artists, teachers, organizers, and they were from both the United States, right? That's the binacional, the binational part, consisting mostly of Chicanas and Mexicanas. The collective stated mission was to help construct a new movement that supports and highlights the spiritual and human components to the diverse struggles experienced by women in the border region. And so although they had all been working on various political conditions independent of each other for many years, they realized that as the effects of post-NAFTA conditions became more visible, these policies had created more pressure on women, right? What I mentioned earlier, the sexual harassment, the lower salaries, the threat of unemployment, contamination, and even toxic waste from the maquiladora industry that affects their communities as their roles, in their roles as mothers, wives, community members. There's a community in Tijuana called Chipancingo, and that's a fascinating story of resistance to that. If you're interested in this, I can tell you more about. but they actively fought to clean up a site of a maquiladora who had abandoned their, this happens often, and abandoned their maquila and had left lead in the ground. And then when it would rain, it would wash into their community and their river. And so the residents organized with a community group in the United States around this issue. Nonetheless, by drawing from these experiences, their diverse experiences, the women actively sought to move beyond their individual locations and have a broader reach through their collective action. So one of the things that they've done is they really want to build a network, right? And so they organized this encuentro with other activists. And it was really one of the first grassroots binational women-centered meeting in the region. And it was actually hosted there in the community of Maquiladoras in the Women's Center. And they had many objectives, right? To examine ties that exist between organizations in Baja California, Mexico, share different organizing experiences, discuss solutions to the problems that they had as women workers, community members, and organizers in this region. And then really to think about ways to create networks of support, right? And so this was a 2-day encuentro that attracted over 40 organizations from California, Baja California. And the fact that it was led by workers, students, and activists who didn't have, the funding or the institutional support, the turnout was really great. And it was really here where this important conversation and critical conversation and exchanges began to take place. And this idea of a cross-border collective identity really emerges, right? And you can see it happening in those exchanges. Another strategy that the Colectiva started to employ was workshops. These workshops were made available to many of the maquiladora workers with the help of some of their contacts, right, through this network, such as, university students, doctors, both US and Mexico based. And basically some of these workshops were around gender rights in the workplace, reproductive rights, safety issues, highlighting the needs of women and patriarchy. Also in collaboration with other grassroots organizations along the border. They even created like a video in order to document and to tell the story of how women workers have the right to organize. Another strategy that they use is cross-border actions, and I'll tell a quick story about, there was a maquila that closed shop, like I did. They would do this overnight and not pay workers. And it so happened that this particular maquiladora, the owner lived in San Diego. And so the organizers found this out. And so while the organizers in Tijuana were unable to cross into San Diego, they protested and set up camp at the maquiladora demanding their wages. And on the US side, the activists actually went to the home of this owner and protested in front of his house. And I remember one of the organizers telling me, well, I mean, it was like either luck on our part and bad luck on his part, but he happened to have a barbecue that day. And so they were out there protesting this owner who had abandoned shop and abandoned the workers on a day like when he had family and friends over. So, so these are some of the ideas that, and the work that the Colectiva demonstrates how women border dwellers and activists are sort of beginning to create this broader definition of community. For example, the space created in the encuentro allowed women to discover the commonalities across the geopolitical divide. In some ways, the border is momentarily erased, and they could see these trans-border issues that are affecting women, that included land and housing concerns, access to public services, the racialization of environmental health. And then through these discussions, the participants repeatedly named the state and the transnational companies as the powers that shaped their realities. And so they were able to highlight their similarities in their experiences as laborers in the global political economy that had no difference what side of the border they were on, right? So their stories demonstrate that the exploitation lived and felt by those devalued in the market, poor third world women, is experienced on either side of the border. And so in this way, I saw like a collective transfronteriza identity created, right? And of course, they also shared victories. campaigns against transnational companies, coalition building, they had in their locales, in their communities. And so they were able really to learn from each other strategies and modes of change, right? And when we think about how in an environment like Maquiladoras, where women are stripped of their humanity and encouraged to compete against one another, the very same workers not only work to restore humanity and rights in the workplace, but support each other in their shared and individual fights. Had it not been for CITAC and the Colectiva Feminista, Vicky, the woman that I mentioned earlier, would not have had her right to medical care restored, nor would she have become the leader she is today within the movement, right? So now I want to shift to another area of study, which I have been living in the last 15 years. So I've lived in the state of Arizona since 2005, during a time when state and local politics have been rapidly responding to shifting demographics caused by global economic policies, same ones that affect the women in the Tijuana and San Diego area. And of course, these national calls for border enforcement, both of which have radically shifted migration patterns in this state. As a result, there has been a strategically fashioned climate of fear and dehumanization of Mexican, Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, indigenous migrants by local politicians who have in many ways been quite successful at codifying this through law and popular consciousness with brutal launches of legislative powers. And of course, as we know, the funneling effect of and the increased migrant crossing across the Sonoran Desert and the historically conservatism of this state, these bills were very anti-immigrant, and some that were most widely known was the SB 1070, also known as the Show Me Your Papers bill, and then the Ethnic Studies bill, which was HB 2281. And then, of course, federal policies like 287G allowed governments to collude with federal policies on immigration enforcement, workforce raids, police brutality, and mass detention and incarceration, which there in Maricopa County became known as the reign of terror caused by former Sheriff Joe Arpaio. And so much of my research in the last 10 years has been focused on documenting and making visible the stories of communities and workers responding, organizing, and thriving despite these conditions. So one project I looked at early on was the Worker Rights Center in Phoenix, Arizona, where workers were organizing against wage theft, similar to what would happen with Maquiladoras in Tijuana. And they were doing really incredible work for 10 years, close to 10 years. And I want to acknowledge that how some of this early work, on this organizing over the last 15 years really paved the way for the shift in these electoral results that we saw in this year's elections, right? But I also want to recognize that the incendiary rhetoric in popular media directly impacts the embodied experiences of vulnerable communities, especially migrants, right? But if we focus on the ways in which women, in particular, are simultaneously demonized and erased in the public imaginary, their images deformed, sanitized, or homogenized, we can see how this underscores the urgency for a measured, coherent feminist response. And so I want to talk about two projects that have emerged that I've also been involved in. One is called the Entre Nosotras Collective, and the second is called the Binational Arts in Residence. So the Entre Nosotras Collective was a group that was publicly active in the Phoenix area between 2013 and 2015. So as a co-founder of the project, my perspective is one, of an insider intimately involved in the production of activities and conversations ignited by this work. And created with principles of feminist pedagogy and horizontal leadership, we came together to transform Arizona's socio-political landscape. Our work intersected academic inquiry, arts, and activism, and our goals as a collective were to refocus debates about culture in its broadest conception, to bridge perceived communication gaps in our community, and to create new audiences and venues for the exhibition of work by women artists who are critically reflecting on their own positions as women of color, Latinx, Chicana, Chicanos, Chicanx, Indigenous, Afro-descendants, and Mestizas. We enacted community engagement through the deliberate crossing between and across elite university spaces and popular community spaces, And we had a vision that was to create community embedded events in collaboration with Chicana, Latino, Indigenous women, and gender nonconforming artists. We fostered critical dialogues around gender, sexuality, race, class, and cultura across borders. And so we did many events over the course of our time together, and I can just go scroll through some of these slides. There's a really cool video, but I'll pass it because I know I've been talking a lot, but there's a really cool video when we invited a group called Entre Mujeres to our city. They did a performance at the Civic Plaza in downtown Phoenix. And what was really interesting about that is that then they did these workshops at a community organization called Dona Tierra, and out of those workshops, then the Son Jarocho Collective emerges because we wanted to retain this cultural tradition that comes from the state of Veracruz. We also curated art exhibits. We brought in filmmakers, theater performers, Monica Palacios, and I think we can scroll through the next slide. And this is the art exhibit that we curated that highlighted Chicana, Latinx, Indigenous artists from Arizona that were really responding to this political climate, really trying to shift the landscape that in which we had these conversations, in which we made our experiences more visible. We can go on more in some of the workshops. You can just kind of go through them. Okay, we stop right before where it says BNAR. So while Entre Nosotras ended a few years ago, I want to underscore two components of our work that respond directly to the resistance, insistence, and belonging in the borderlands, both geographically and symbolically, as we move between the academy and community spaces. First, dialogue, right? So we used art to stimulate dialogue as a way of indirectly talking about issues and having conversations around race, class, gender, sexuality, migration. As one collective member states, it's not the same thing to tell my very conservative white aunt from the suburb, hey, come to a lecture on racism, as it is to come to this art show, where then we could, talk more about these issues, right? We also practice autonomy and horizontal leadership. And I also thought about how do we navigate these institutions that we form part of, so that really if we were connected to the universities and even some of the funding institutions, how did they not dictate what it was that we did, and that we still shape the work we do from beginning to end as people who identify as women of color and as feminists, right? The other project that I wanted to bring in was the Binational Arts Residency. And sorry, Mesky, for making you go through all those slides. So basically, BNR began with the idea of connecting cultural communities in the Sonoran Desert with issues of social justice, history, identity through art. Over the course of the residency, artists, cultural workers, and students collaborate to create artistic workshops, performances, and public talks in their communities, with the express intent to build dialogue around social issues. And so each BNR includes an artistic collaboration at the border and in community across Phoenix, Douglas, Tijuana, Autumn, Nogales, Agua Prieta, etc. And there's this image of a constellation. Can you pull that up?
Which slide is that on?
Is it like a black one with like a constellation? Do you see?
It's on the side of this, not the one that's on this slide right here.
Oh my gosh, this is what I get for having my screen.
Oh. Is this it?
Yeah, that's it. Sorry about that. Thank you. So this is an idea where when I'm thinking about like this, this imaginary, how do we connect communities beyond this divide, right? And so this is sort of like an imagery that we use as part of this collaboration. And if there's a video, can you pull up the video? I think it's that one, yeah. One of the artists that we had was Teresa Fernandez. She was the first artist who came and did a residency. And she did this really interesting collaboration at the border.
Can you see this now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Maybe turn it up a little bit. You might have to take out your
Oh, I don't know. 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 I
hay una calle que continúa, o sea, que empieza en México y continúa en Estados Unidos, pero hay esta frontera, esta barrera que impide el movimiento, ¿no? A través de esta calle. Entonces, creando como que la sensación como si nomás estuviera el cielo. ¿Por qué no ver este espacio como si fuéramos una humanidad? No somos dos culturas, digo, sí somos diferentes culturas, pero es bajo el mismo cielo, ¿no? Entonces, como que una unidad y traer o crear esa sensación de unión.
Thank you. So this is one of the first artists, and then in the slide you'll see a picture of what she did here in Agua Prieta. That's, I think it might be the next one. Yeah, so on the left, that's the one where in the border region, San Diego, Tijuana, and I'm taking a picture from the Mexican side in Playas de Tijuana, and the second image is in Agua Prieta. So she's, creating this imagery of erasing the border. Like, how can we imagine the border erased? And so I think that, across the multiple experiences with the artists, we really tried to create dialogue and make sure that they interacted with local communities who were, embattled in their own communities and trying to figure out ways to use art as a practice of social transformation, right? And I think I'm going to skip this next session on Chicana motherwork because I feel like I've been talking for quite a bit, and I want to definitely go to questions, but let me just wrap up my thoughts here. And I'm happy to talk about Chicana motherwork in our Q&A if there are any questions. So some of my closing thoughts is that my goal was to ask you today to think about the US-Mexico border and the borderlands, not just as a place of passage, right? But as a site for conviviality, resistance, and community building. The work that is done through these collective spaces that I've outlined remind ourselves of our interconnectedness, to be and to model non-hierarchical communities, to build relationships with one another, to utilize collective and public pedagogies, to build power with and not over, and to create what Hassim Bey calls temporary autonomous zones, right? For me, organizing autonomously and collective builds solidarities in ways that decenter institutions and nation states and instead center directly impacted community. How do we behave in the day-to-day as much as possible in a way that we envision the world we want? And to remind ourselves that empire isn't totalizing. And in some ways, I believe that we need to sort of deepen the grietas or cracks. Grietas is a word that Zapatistas use to talk about the spaces in between empire where we're organizing. So these cracks that the state has not been able to occupy, and how do we connect them in order to further unravel the layered systems of domination and capital? So with that, I'll end. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much, Meski, for doing those slides for me. I appreciate it.